Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Building the Black Educator Pipeline Podcast. I am your host, educator activist Shana Terrell, and welcome back to all of our supporters and co-conspirators, and also our new viewers this week. We love you guys, and we appreciate the support as always. I hope you guys are out here staying safe and being your best self as you walk in this life. So this is the place we come every week to talk to real people in the real struggle doing the real work. So shout out to the Center for Black Educator Development and Citizens Ed for making this platform possible for us. So this week, we're still going to be focusing on the benefits of Black teachers in the classroom. Today, we're going to be focusing on this notion of lift as we climb. We always talk a lot about standing on the shoulders of giants. But do we ever ponder why and how we got to stand on the shoulders of giants? But really how we do that is because they lifted us up there. They helped us climb to that position. So right now in this moment, I think a lot of us listening are educators or doing work in the education space. So I want you to think about that. Are you doing the work to lift as you climb? Are we preparing and building the next generation of educators to come into the fold with us? But that's precisely the story of my guest today. But before I introduce them, I have a question for you all out there, all my co-conspirators watching. Are you doing the work to lift as you climb? And if you are, how are you doing that work? Again, are you out there as an educator doing the work to lift as you climb? And if you are, how are you doing that work? So please welcome our guests today, Miss Latosha Guy and Dr. Jarvis Givens. Latosha Guy wears many titles: National Board Certified Teacher, Veteran Teacher, California TeachPlus Policy Fellow, Delta Teacher Efficacy Campaign Teacher Leader, NEA Ed Community Facilitator, Cultural and Linguistic Responsive Teaching Fellow, former advisor to California Writing Project, presenter, and mentor. Y'all, my girl's out there doing her thing, okay? She is most proud of her work as a formal and informal mentor to Black and other educators of colors throughout Los Angeles, as well as her advocacy for improved reading, instruction, and secondary teaching education programs and improved professional development for both teachers and administrators. She holds a master's degree in reading education from California State University, Los Angeles, and the Reading Specialist Credential. So please welcome to the show, Ms. Latosha Guy. And my next guest, Dr. Jarvis R. Givens, a native of Compton, California, is an assistant professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education, a faculty affiliate in the Department of African and American Studies, and the Suzanne Young Murray Assistant Professor at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. Givens earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of California, Berkeley. He is a Mellon Mays Ford Foundation and Gates Fellow. Jarvis is a co-director of a major new research project called the Black Teacher Archives with Dr. Imani Perry of Princeton University. Givens is also the co-director of We Dare Say Love, supporting achievements in education life of Black boys. He lives in Roxbury, Massachusetts. So please, everybody, welcome to the show, Latosha and Jarvis. Hey, y'all.
Hey.
I appreciate both of y'all coming through to Building the Black Educator Pipeline. It's much appreciated that you guys came to visit us today and share your story.
Thanks for the invitation.
Of course. Listen, the work you guys are doing is super important, and I want folks to hear about this story. So first I want to get into, I think it's always important when we have educators on the show for folks to hear, how did you guys get into education? So what was your journey to education? Why did you guys become educators? And Jarvis, you can go first, and then Ms. Guy, let you roll in.
I didn't realize that I was on the trajectory to become an educator. To be honest, when I went to college, I feel like all of my life I had thought I want to be a lawyer. I feel like one of the very few professional kind of careers that are kind of pushed onto you because there's oftentimes a very limited range and perspective in terms of like what success looks like, what you do to kind of become successful, so to speak. But, you know, I always liked kind of speaking publicly and things like that. And so I guess for a number of people that, you know, read as maybe you can be a lawyer, right? And so that was something that was put in my mind very early on. So I went to college and I thought that's what I wanted to do. But even when I was in college, I was always involved in, like, I used to help facilitate and coordinate after school programs for students in in Berkeley. My entire time as an undergrad student. And then even when I was a graduate, I was a business major. I was planning on going to law school, but then I had these courses, my African-American studies courses, and also took some kind of like ethnic studies and like history courses that I always felt like I was really developing the most as a thinker in. And I was always sharing this information with people that I was around, whether it was in like community organizations or student organizations that I was in. And two of my professors in college, and both of them were African-American professors, encouraged me to think about getting a PhD. And that completely kind of shifted my trajectory. I didn't really know what getting a PhD entailed until these two professors pulled me aside and encouraged me to do that, and encouraged me to apply to this fellowship program intentionally created to develop a pipeline for underrepresented students to go into the professoriate called Mellon Mays. So you know, historic Black educator Benjamin Mays, former president of Morehouse College. But that's what kind of led to me shifting gears and looking away from law school and actually saying getting a PhD and going into academia might actually be something that I'm well suited for, and I can do the things that these professors that I have that inspire me do as my work. Yeah,
that's dope. And I want to continue to lift this up. We've had many educators come on this show, and y'all heard Jarvis's story. Somebody tapped that brother and said, brother, you need to think about doing this. So we need to focus on how we are doing that more, you know, for our young people, the potential that we see in them, the gifts that we see in them, tapping them on the shoulder and helping them guide the way. Because this brother, you couldn't tell him he probably wasn't about to own his own business. He still can in some respects. But the fact that he's in education is dope and a gift to all of us. Miss Guy, let's hear about your journey, because you are still in the classroom, which I find amazing. We're going to talk about that a little later on. But what was your journey to becoming an educator? Why did you become an educator?
You know, my mother is a retired special education teacher and a language arts teacher. And my father was an engineer, but then he taught math at the college level. So I always saw my parents doing this work, and my mother would, you know, tell us, oh, let's color. You know, we would sit down and color with her and cut out little shapes. I later found out like we were doing her room decorations when we were little. You know, she made it seem like we were doing crafts, but we were doing her decorations. And then I went to the school my mom taught at. And so after school, and this is in Alabama, in Huntsville, Alabama, after school, I would work with the special education students, and it just really gave me this feeling of fulfillment. And then, to be frank, I put it on pause until going to Cal State LA, and I worked with incoming freshmen. And I knew working with incoming freshmen, teaching them reading and writing skills, like I knew teaching was something that I wanted to do. I also knew that I wanted to become a journalist. And so lately in my teaching career, I've started to combine, you know, the teaching with the writing and getting my voice out there.
Dope. And that's how you became a teacher. And for my guests out there, I know you guys have questions about the book. We are going to get into it, The Art of Black Teaching, a little bit later. But I really think it's important for us to talk about how did he become, right? The writer of Fugitive Pedagogy. There were people who poured into this brother. This brother had a community. Ms. Guy was an important part of that community. So Ms. Guy, could you talk to us about how the two of you connected? Like, how did you meet Jarvis? How did you guys meet to kind of form this lifelong bond that you have?
So I am blessed to teach at a high school, King Drew Magna High School in Los Angeles. And Jarvis was a student of mine, I want to say 2004. And during 2004, 2003, I was working on my national board portfolio, and I had to pick two students. And Jarvis was one of my focal students that I selected. And I'll never forget doing an assessment. I assess all my students on day one. I give them a battery of assessments, surveys. They write something. I give them a text and they write something. And something Jarvis wrote on his reading survey just struck me. He said that, I asked, do you like to read? Yes, I like to read. Where do you read? And he's like, I sit up at my desk and read. And for whatever reason, just that question, and I don't know if he's remembering it because he's kind of shaking his head, but that question just intrigued me. Like, I never read a reading survey where a 10th grader is like, I sit up, at my desk and read stories. It just really piqued my interest. And then looking at his writing and his communication, the way he communicated ideas, I was like, okay, bam, I have my 2 students. So I had to pick, per the national board's guidelines, I needed an English language learner. So I picked my English language learner, and I believed Jarvis to be a standard English learner. And so I picked him, and then I pretty much focused on his entire class. And then our relationship just grew from there.
And I'm gonna embarrass you real quick, Ms. Guy, only because one of our viewers said, "How youthful, Latosha! Hard to believe you're the teacher. You look like his peer."
Wow,
so,
thank you.
What did I say? When I got the picture of the 2 of you, I literally had to ask, "Is this the right Latosha Guy? Because this supposed to be his teacher. You sure she didn't graduate with him?" So shout out to the person out there who was thinking the same thing I was when I first saw this guy. Like, that is his teacher. That's his classmate.
Teacher.
Yeah, I mean, you've been in the game for a long time, but definitely very youthful. Jarvis, so that experience for you, how did you experience this guy and that experience back then?
Yeah, that was it's funny. I definitely remember a conversation about, when I was in Ms. Guy's class, thinking about, my own identity as like a reader and as like a writer. It's like, where in your home do you like do this and stuff like that? And I was like, oh, well, I probably said desk, but that's really just my grandmother's dining room table that I turned into my desk. Right. And I feel like, if I had space there, people allowed me to have that space there. And like, in my home, they recognize that. It was like, he's over there working and we make space for that here at the house. But it probably wasn't like an actual desk. That's probably what it was. But I would say that in Ms. Guy's class, I started to become a lot more aware of myself and that I could be intentional about how I decided to be a writer and a reader. That I could make choices about what I wanted to read. I can make choices about how I wanted to write. And I think a lot of that had to do probably with the fact, actually, I don't think it was just because she was going through the national board certification process. I think that from what I recall from Ms. Guy, she was very transparent in terms of helping students understand, process, why we're doing certain things that we're doing, and how these things are supposed to be strategies for you to employ in terms of, for you to get the most out of the experience of reading, but also writing. And I think that experience for me was very helpful because up until that time, I think I might have shared this to you in a previous conversation, Shayna, but I didn't think of myself as a very strong writer. I actually felt like that was the class I struggled the most in. Math and science, math classes and things like that, I could kind of get by on. I had to work a lot harder when it came to reading and writing. And I assumed that Ms. Guy knew that as well, but I didn't necessarily, I don't know. But for me, I feel like in that class, I was given resources where I feel like I could kind of take ownership over my experience in striving to be a better writer, right? And so that was an important turning point for me in terms of my own academic identity.
So, Ms. Guy, I want to say something, but I want to get your reaction to what he just said because I heard that. Wow. So, what shocked you about that? Did you not know he wasn't a strong writer?
I remember reading his writing, and I remember, because I'm a speaker of African American vernacular. And so I remember seeing traits like circumlocution, things like that. There's just this rich narrative storytelling possibility. And so the wow came from, Jarvis, I never knew you considered yourself weak in English, so to speak, and you were stronger in like math and science, just because when we would hear you speak, we would think, I would think minister or, writer, lawyer, a career in which both written expression and oral expression were very important. Like I never, ever, ever, I'm going to be positive to my math colleagues, but I never knew that was your strong suit,
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that, go ahead, Jarvis.
No, I was going to say, that's why for me, when I went to college, like, becoming a business major or something was, I remember, I felt like that was something that it was easier for me to do. Whereas the writing process just seemed a lot more challenging for me. And I should also say the teacher I had the year before, Miss Guy, was a great teacher, but I don't necessarily know. I felt like, I got like a D for like the first time in my life in my English class the year before. And I think it was because a lot of the resources that I had as a speaker and in terms of my form of kind of oral expression and writing, there were ways that Ms. Guy was able to notice certain elements of, what she calls African-American vernacular English or Black speech, Black English in my communication style that the teacher the year before me may not have necessarily been able to pick up on. Right. But in Guy class, I was given resources to figure out how to bridge between the strengths of those forms of communication and how that translated on the page, that there were strategies that I could employ to build on those resources, and that they weren't impediments to writing, but they were actually resources that had to be honed in a very particular way in order to express myself as a writer, and even to think about how I engage with text as a reader as well, with how those resources could come into play. So I think just so that's probably where my experience coming into like 10th grade English was at. I had a really hard time the year before, and I didn't necessarily know why I was having such a hard time, but I felt like I got clarity around what I was doing, what I was up against in Ms. Guy's class.
I think that's amazing. And I want to highlight this, and I know Ms. Guy is not going to take any credit for this, but she definitely should. So to have an English class where a young man has learned to put his oral expression on paper to where he has communicated that he felt ownership, and then, I don't know, 20 years later, he then writes a book entitled Fugitive Pedagogy, right? So you actually taught him to put his words to paper. To this young man went on to becoming a doctor, a doctor, and writing a book that we are speaking into existence. People go out to get the book so that we can make this book a bestseller, Fugitive Pedagogy by Jarvis Givens. But the fact that you poured into him is amazing. And that speaks to this notion of lifting as we climb. So you were a teacher, you were getting your national board certification, but then you were in that classroom pouring into other young people to become a success like Jarvis did today in life. So take a little credit. You definitely put a little brick in this house to a part of Jarvis's village, his community, and raising that up. So definitely shout out to you. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what Jarvis spoke about, understanding that vernacular. The one he would speak at home, the one he would speak with friends, and the one that he's supposed to speak, in English class. Why is that important for teachers to realize the dynamics between those two things? And how does that shape young people in the classroom?
I think language is who we are. And as educators, especially Black educators, because I speak African-American vernacular English, but even if you don't, it's important for an educator to recognize that language is neither good nor bad. It is. And because I have the cultural competence and understand the rules of African-American vernacular English, some of my heroes in education, Dr. Geneva Smitherman, Dr. Noma Lemoyne, who created the AMP program and LAUSD, just seeing what Jarvis and all of my students brought to the classroom and still bring as assets rather than deficits, it enhances just your ability to reach kids, to teach them to celebrate their home vernacular, to celebrate the vernacular that they speak in class, that it has power, that it is amazingly complex, it's rule governed, and then also to know that society expects you to be able to code switch. I guess that's the best way that I can say it. And when to be able to code switch, when to, go into your home vernacular. And so I think when you look at California, when you think of some notable incidents regarding African-American vernacular English, I know that Oakland Unified School District declared that African-American vernacular English was something that teachers needed to have knowledge of in order to reach Black students. And I know the United States National Linguistic Society said that, language is language, and African-American vernacular has a long history. It is rule governed. It is I guess you could say, a synchronism of our African heritage mixed in with English. And so when you look at reading achievement with Black students, I think that's one of the keys that many educators need to possess in terms of how to recognize the strengths and how to recognize the needs that Black students have today, especially as it relates to reading and writing.
Yeah. It's funny, guy. I can think about so like one particular example, and because there'll be some people that will hear what was just shared and say, oh, so this means you're advocating and talking about teaching Ebonics in school as the kind of form of English, right? This is a way that some folks would hear that and immediately offer it as some kind of thin critique, right? As opposed to recognizing that what's being shared is that what's being acknowledged in saying what Ms. Guy just said is that we recognize that these are resources and assets that students bring to the classroom that can be used as a bridge to help them excel in the academic culture and based on the academic norms in school, when there's a level of intentionality and respect for the culture and the identity that the students are bringing. And one of the things I probably didn't realize this at the time when we were doing it, but there's one assignment. You may or may not remember this, Ms. Guy, that we did. I remember there was like 2 different texts that was paired together for us an assignment. One was a radio recording of an interview of like a young Black woman in New York. I think her name was like Shakima or Shakira or something like that. On an episode from like Radio Raheem, I believe it was the radio, like the DJ's name. But she was talking about, it was her talking about something about luxury, what she considers to be luxuries in life and things that are hold value, et cetera, et cetera. That interview, which was very expressive of Black expressive culture in a particular way, was paired with a reading by Hans Magnus Enzensberger called The Future of Luxury. And Hans Magnus Enzensberger was this kind of German writer, also writing about this theme of luxury in life, right? And we had to have a very robust class conversation speaking about this idea of luxury across these different texts and recognizing that there's something about human experience that you can see across these things that we then had to like write about. But even modeled in that one particular assignment, because it's just something that's coming, it just kind of came to the top of my mind, is speaking to, what I hear you saying there is that there is a way that you can kind of think creatively about how you build on the resources that students have and how you go about structuring classroom experiences that have the kind of objectives, the learning objectives in mind, but that also have the students in mind and at the forefront about what's the kind of reading material and the way of reaching them to kind of offer them the needs that they have to be successful and to develop strong and positive academic identities, right? But that's one of the things that came to mind. I just wanted to share that when you were talking.
Yes. And if we ground this conversation in some more historical context and a lot of the work that you did, Jarvis, what are some practices that you saw, that you experienced from Ms. Guy that relate to some of the teachers in the book that you wrote about?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest things is that, Ms. Guy was a teacher that knew the students that she was teaching and wasn't kind of foreign from the cultural context that they were coming from, right? That, Carter G. Woodson says the education of any people must begin with the people themselves. And that means that there has to be an awareness and a recognition of the knowledge that the people who are students actually have in order to kind of meet their needs and to recognize what their needs are. And, that's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to be done when there's a shared kind of set of interests and shared kind of cultural context. But you can't rely on that. That's important, but it's insufficient, right? But when teachers are intentional about drawing on those resources in creative and thoughtful ways to allow that to inform their pedagogy, that can become very powerful. The teachers I write about were very aware of that. And they were aware that they had to kind of step outside of the formal protocols of curriculum mandates and education policy to develop the resources that they needed to meet the needs of their students, and to have some level of influence over the work that they were doing, right? Their job wasn't just to be, empty vessels that allow for some system to kind of pass through, but they understood themselves to also be producers of knowledge and to be intellectuals. And the way that teachers show up as scholars of the practice and, as intellectuals is by doing that kind of work, right? One of the things a previous conversation Ms. Guy and I had, this might have been during the national, this might have been after I graduated from high school, but one of the things we said is that at the heart of any good teacher is a researcher, right? And I think that really, comes through in terms of how she was approaching the stuff when she talked about national board certification, but even in terms of how she made sure that she was aware and attuned to the identities of her students, which in many ways was a kind of shared identity oftentimes because we were Black students, very similar kind of cultural context. She's familiar with our neighborhoods, where we came from, and that was able to translate into how we showed up in the classroom.
Dope. So Ms. Guy, and I hear him talking a lot about the similarities, but I hear a lot of like shared experience, shared cultural awareness. I would love for both of you to talk about your experience at King Drew. And Ms. Guy, how did that have an impact on you as a teacher, and Jarvis, you as a student?
I probably wouldn't still be teaching 22 years had I not started teaching. Or actually, my first year teaching was at Morningside High School. And then my second year, and from year 2 on to now, I've been at King Drew. King Drew is an oasis, and it especially was an oasis for Black teachers at the time that I taught Jarvis. Many of my mentors were African-American teachers, and they were right next door, or they were upstairs. So in terms of being a place where as an educator, we shared the responsibility of teaching, our next generations of students. And so when we talk about Black educators today and why many Black educators are leaving the profession, many African Americans don't choose teaching because of that tremendous burden that they may feel as being the only Black educator or one of few Black educators in a school site. I didn't have that experience. My experience is being a practitioner with other practitioners who look like me, who share the experiences that I've shared or that the experiences of my students. I'm able to be mentored. I'm able to vent. I'm able to relax. I'm also able to share resources and be poured into in a way that if anyone is serious about attracting and retaining Black teachers, they need to definitely investigate their school culture to see, is it a culture that pours into Black students? Because if it doesn't pour into Black students, how can it pour into Black educators? And so King Drew has poured into me as a Black educator and other educators of color as well. And it's just an amazing, an amazing place. And when we talk about accountability, I felt accountable to my students because the students at King Drew will call you out if a lesson was not, if it didn't work out, you get called out. And then your colleagues, like I've always taught with my door open. My greatest fear is, Miss Hutch or Dr. Fletcher or Miss Fordham, Miss Bacham Rice, walking in and the lesson is not, so we were there to support each other, to give each other that critical feedback, that accountability, as were the students. And Jarvis will tell you.
Yeah. One of the things that I will also say that I don't think I appreciated until now, I'm able to look back on it, but I also think that the majority of the folks who were administrators and leaders at the school were also people who matriculated into those positions from the classroom in that particular school. That might be different now, but at least when I was there, I can think about the principal, who was the principal of the school I know had formerly been a teacher, a math teacher at the school at one point. The person who was the college counselor was a former English teacher. I think might be the English teacher she was the English teacher that you came in to replace. Ms. Guy. And so I think that had a lot to do with establishing a strong kind of academic identity for the school, but also for the students who came into the school, is that there's a way that we do things here. There's a college going culture. This is a school that's in Watts, arm's length away from the projects, right? And there's work that we're here doing collectively. And even when it wasn't explicitly stated, I felt like that was embedded in the ecological context of the school, right? The social systems that shape the identity of the school, and that students, you kind of became initiated into when you got there, because students that were in, that's just kind of how things operated from the teacher level to the administrator level down to students who were like more senior. And I would also say that students also played a very important role in terms of leadership at the school, which was something that I found to be quite profound. And I don't know if, that's not often the case. And this is not just in terms of planning, pep rallies and stuff like that. It was also about planning anything that was meaningful at the school. I felt like there was a way in which students were incorporated in that process. So that made us feel, like we were empowered to say, this teacher that's over here is not doing a good job. This new history teacher that we like, they just write stuff on the board and tell us to like fill in the blanks or something like that. And that's not how it's supposed to be going here, right? And we felt empowered to do that because there was a level of an expectation of excellence for the students, but also a level of an expected level of excellence from the teachers as well, that everyone seemed to be transparent about.
But that spirit of like, number one, just the collectivism within your community at that school is dope. But then the expectation of excellence, right? Like, we are excellent and we're going to be basically who we are within this community, right? Like, that's the standard. It's dope. But do y'all think that was easier for you guys and easier for students to thrive because the community was predominantly Black?
It's possible, but I feel like there was a way. It was 75% Black students at the time when I was there, and I would say, and it was close to the other 25% was Latinx students, and there was a significant number of strong Latinx teachers at the school as well. But it was definitely majority Black students and a very strong set of kind of Black teachers, and there were a number of white teachers at the school as well, but who kind of got with the academic program that in many ways was set and really steered by many of the kind of veteran Black teachers at the school, like, one of Ms. Guy's senior colleagues, Ms. Hutchinson, who I believe may have been the chair of the English department at the time, who had been teaching in LAUSD since, she started in 1966, amidst the Watts uprising, is when she started teaching, and, got to, King Drew, and had been teaching there for a very long period of time. And I would say that it was that same kind of, loving experience around learning and stuff like that. I would say that most of my peers that were Latinx students also experienced as well. And we didn't just read Black text, right? I'm thinking about Ms. Guy's class. We also, how the Garcia girls lost their accents when I was, in Ms. Hutch's class, Barrio Boy, right? These were, it wasn't like we're only just going to do Black stuff and we're going to ignore the fact that there are Latinx students here. Right, even as the majority of the school were Black students, right, there was still a very intentional way that that a similar kind of intentionality around meeting the needs and respecting the culture of Black students that was also extended to Latinx students at the school as well.
And that's amazing, the inclusivity that was there and the respect of being culturally competent, right? So for somebody like Ms. Guy and her colleagues, I think sometimes when we talk about cultural competence, people stamp it as like, that means you need to know how to teach Black children. But no, it literally means what it says. Culture. Where are you at? Understanding and being aware of the culture which you're serving in, and making sure you're affirming that for children and also the people that are serving. I think that is super major. And it's not like King Drew just had some amazing elements of that as you guys existed.
But I would also say that, and I don't want to diminish the fact, it was definitely I would be comfortable calling it a Black pedagogical model that lent itself to also being inclusive to other. If we're going to trace the tradition, I don't like to use the language of inclusivity too broadly, because I think it can kind of distort something that I think is rightful to call it for what it is that there were teachers operating in a tradition that was a tradition of Black teaching that they themselves had. What we think about, Ms. Guy can talk about coming from, both of her parents being educators. Ms. Hutch, the previous educator that I talked about, began her education at the Frederick Douglass School in Arkansas, right? And segregated Jim Crow school. She had excellent teachers there before she moved to California, where she had some very traumatic experiences in California schools. But she built on the best of the kind of early education that she had to kind of shape her own political orientation to teaching. And I think that those kinds of, that political clarity that I would say that did come from a very, Black experience of these teachers translated to how they shaped the school culture. And that linked itself to also including other folks as well. But it wasn't just a kind of, the kind of broad language of inclusivity and diversity, et cetera, because I wouldn't water it down to suggest that. Even as I appreciate what you shared there, Shane, I would definitely say that it lent itself to inclusion and equity for all folks, because it emerges from a place of Black teachers challenging dominance in the schools. That is something that is important for justice and education for all students, whether they're Latinx, whether they are white or otherwise.
And I appreciate you lifting and connecting that point, because one of the things I thought about from listening to both of your stories is when you're in an environment like that, number one, yes, diversity and inclusion that waters things down, but sometimes it's at the heart of who we are as Black people. Our culture isn't oppressive, right? We're just naturally not that's not our tradition. We are Black, we are strong in our Blackness, but we are a people who are collective and inclusive just in the nature of who we are. And I think that if you don't highlight it in the way you did, people don't understand that is our way of being in the world. I also think being at a place like a King Drew, you're fighting whiteness, but you're fighting it in a different way. And I think that's important to highlight and lift up, especially again, when we bring it back to the art of Black teaching and fugitive pedagogy. When people have a shared practice, right, or a common goal in education and what they're working towards and what they're fighting against or what we're doing. So one of the questions I'll pose to you, Ms. Guy, is you weren't teaching in a Jim Crow segregated South where political education is always at the forefront when you're dealing with Black children, but it isn't this notion to fight Jim Crow. What would you say was the shared experience or common experience in King Drew for those teachers? What were you guys promoting or fighting against to make sure that these Black children succeeded?
The school was established in a strategic location on the corner of 120th and Compton, right across the street from the Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital and right adjacent to King Drew University, which is the only university designated a historically Black college in California. And the founders, one of them, Sweet Alice, said that the dream was when students graduated from King Drew, they could look behind them and see Charles Drew University and enroll for school, for college. And then they could look across the street and get a job as a doctor or a nurse or anyone in the health fields, as access to healthcare has always been tenuous in the African-American community. It became apparent. So the school was actually founded with a medicine and science focus or base. But it became apparent as the school expanded that students might not necessarily be interested in the health fields, but they still were exposed to it. Students at King Drew, even to this day, take hospital, and the hospital careers program is a very important part of the school. But it was apparent that, as educators, our goal is to equip our students with the habits of mind, the critical thinking abilities, the reading and writing skills, the ability to compute, so that they will be successful, that they will go on to a 4-year university, and that they will graduate. And that was our intent from day one. When our principal, Dr. Roy, hired us, and then after he passed away, when Dr. Woods would hire, you're going to have to tutor after school, right? Are you okay with that? That there's this expectation of being involved in the lives of the students and being part of a community that each one of us made up. And so making up that community, it became bigger than who we are. And that was just the expectation that was set from us from day one.
It's amazing. And I think that's important too, right? Like when you're bringing Black educators in and figuring out how to sustain them, but organizing everybody around a shared goal and a common purpose, right? Because as you're teaching Black children and you're pouring in, you already knew when you were hired with like what we here to do, right? And the mission that we're about to fulfill, then it creates like a movement of togetherness. But then you orient children into that. And I think that that's what a lot of schools and a lot of places are missing. But I think that's also what highlights what made King Drew such a special place. Earlier, somebody wrote in the comments, KD stand up. So I guess that was like like your thing. I want to get into a little bit more detail and hear from each of you, because we keep throwing out the phrase, the art of Black teaching. What is the art of Black teaching? Jarvis, can you respond to that? And then Ms. Guy?
Yeah, so thank you. So that's a shout out to the kind of subtitle of, the book is, so it's, Carter G. Woodson in the Art of Black Teaching. And I should say, well, one, let me just give a little explanation about where that language, the art of Black teaching, comes from. Part of that is me writing this book and thinking with a number of other kind of political theorists and other historical texts. There's an earlier book called Persecution and the Art of Writing by Leo Strauss. That's about essentially writers who are writing against the status quo under authoritative regimes, right? And how their writing is coded in particular kind of ways to transmit the ideas that they understand to be important, but that are unorthodox, right? But then there's another book called Domination and the Art of Resistance. I'm saying this to say is I wanted to think about, these are art and the art of writing and the art of resistance, but I wanted to write a story about to capture how Black teachers had been teaching in a way in response to this kind of authoritative context, whether we're thinking about slavery or Jim Crow or domination, right? So understanding this kind of tension between teaching as an act of freedom and as a liberatory project in response to this larger structure of domination. So that's just a little in terms of the kind of intellectual genealogy of that language for me personally. But just thinking about the art of Black teaching as itself, irrespective of those texts, I would say that it has to do with, well, one, the political clarity that I think is always important to lift up about Black teachers historically. That Black teachers from the very beginning, their orientation to their vocation was not just about subject matter expertise. Right. By and large, it began from a place that the work that I'm doing as an educator has to do with trying to unmake and deconstruct so much of this kind of oppressive set of power structures around us. And then so that's kind of a predisposition, but before you even get to, I'm an English teacher, I'm a math teacher, I'm a history teacher, right? Because that political clarity infuses itself into how you show up in the classroom, or it should, into how you organize your lessons, into how you establish relationships with the students that you're teaching, into how you establish relationships with your comrades or other teachers that are teaching in this school community, right? Because there's a larger political mission that is that exceeds anything that's in an exam or a test that you're supposed to be doing, right? So it's about that level of political clarity. But one of the other things that I would say is that it also has to do with building on tradition, right? Teaching with an intentional knowledge about a tradition that you're operating within, right? And I can even just think about in the book, I'm doing this. I'm trying to demonstrate the way, Carter G. Woodson himself was taught by his formerly enslaved uncles, right? His own teacher at his high school was his cousin who was fired because of his political involvement in Huntington, West Virginia, right? This cousin of his is fired from the Frederick Douglass School where he was a student at. So Carter G. Woodson witnessing all of these things, but he's also seeing the way that these teachers are organizing and establishing colored teacher associations, right? And the kind of intellectual freedom that this teacher of his high school was trying to seek out in establishing his own Black-run newspaper, right? In the late 1800s, that led to him being fired. But then it's about the intellectual tradition, is how these students then became teachers themselves. There's a beautiful line from James Weldon Johnson's autobiography along this way. We're all of us on this call, I'm sure, are familiar with the Black National Anthem, or Lift Every Voice and Sing. But there's a line when James Weldon Johnson says, when he wrote that song in 1900, the first time it was ever sung to anyone, it was sung by 500 students, 500 student voices in recognition of, I think, Abraham Lincoln and Booker T. Washington or something like that for an event. But he said the way that this song continued to spread is because some of these students went on to other schools and they kept singing the song. Some of them became teachers and taught it to their students and they kept singing the song, right? And so we now have it as the Black national anthem, but that's something that we inherited from this migration of a kind of a set of pedagogical practices and an intellectual history that we can trace through the story of teachers, right? And so then I'll take someone and think about someone like Miss Guy. And I told you, I was reading her like national board certification, her portfolio statement. And when I was reading this, I was like, oh, she's citing Geneva Smitherman. She's citing Lisa Del Pitt. She's citing W.B. Du Bois, all these Black scholars who had also been school teachers and who wrote explicitly about the political significance of education in relationship to the larger kind of Black political struggles. But the building on the intellectual resources of these Black thinkers is a part of kind of teaching with that a particular tradition in mind, right? We think about someone like Geneva Smitherman and the work that she did in talking and testifying on Black English. Right? I should say when I had a conversation with Geneva Smitherman in the recent past, I said, my high school English teacher told us about your work. She was like, oh, so you knew about this Black English thing even when you were in high school, right? I was like, yeah, that made me. I was like, yeah, I had these teachers who were exposing us to a tradition that was much older than any of us, had ever been alive, right? But it's something that has to do with the kind of moral imperative of Black education that's at the heart of what I would consider to be the art of Black teaching. It's embedded in the work and the intellectual genealogy of Black teachers, the scholarship that they put out, right? You'll be hard pressed to find, very prominent Black intellectuals in the early 20th century that were not either teachers themselves or who were taught by Black teachers, right? And we have to think about the way critical pedagogy among Black teachers has always been at the center of Black political struggle, whether that's Ida B. Wells was a teacher and was fired because, of her resistance and her public criticisms of white school authorities, right? But that's a large part for me about the art of Black teaching, is about inhabiting a tradition that has been passed down to us that really extends back to the period of slavery, right? Those people who were acquiring literacy and meaningful education by theft. That is a tradition that shaped the political orientation to the first Black teachers after emancipation, who were building the first schools in the U.S. South when there were no such thing as public schools in the U.S. South, right? That was a product of formerly enslaved people and a campaign waged by these formerly enslaved people and also the people they elevated to be teachers.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Okay, you better school us. All right.
Right. And to piggyback off of Dr. Givens, just as a practitioner, the knowledge that Black teachers have of our cultural jewels, like when you walk into a classroom with Black students, Black and brown students, and you already know they're orally gifted. So the expectation is that double consciousness that we have as Black educators. What the outside is expecting of them, but you also know their gifts and talents. And the goal is not to shirk your responsibility in honing those gifts and talents. So just in my class, like speaking, debate, it was very central to class, because I know that those are among the gifts and talents of my African American students. We would have students memorize, poems, Shakespeare. That's very much a part of the art of Black teaching, just knowing the gifts and talents and validating, affirming, and demanding that while students grow and develop cultural competence in the dominant method of communication, that they not shirk their responsibility in maintaining cultural competence and excellence in our African American traditions as well. And so I think the art of Black teaching, in addition to the lineage that Jarvis spoke of in terms of crafting the lessons that were relevant and responsive to their needs as students and relevant and responsive to our needs as an oppressed people in the United States as well as the world.
Yeah. And so I would add one thing. So this idea of study is a part of the art of Black teaching, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it in order to do those things that Ms. Guy just referred to, in order to do the things that these teachers that I write about in this book were able to do, right? It became very important for me to see, like, oh, this is how they're getting exposed to this stuff because of these teacher associations that they created, where they were engaging with reading material that was not offered to them in traditional teacher training pathways, right? We see them setting up and forming, study groups where they're writing additional lesson plans that they can offer to students to kind of infuse Black history and culture into the curriculum. This is additional labor that they're taking on, but it's a labor that they're taking on because it's something, that's what they understood to be speaking to the heart of their vocation. Like, their vocation demanded it demanded higher of them, right? Than what, the procedural mandates were from a local white school board. And I'm saying white school board because I'm talking about the context of the Jim Crow South, or in terms of the book, in terms of my book. But that idea of study, right, and being scholars and intellectuals and making sure that that is at the heart of one's pedagogy is important. And oftentimes that means having to create spaces to do that outside of formal educational and pre and in-service teacher training programs that oftentimes don't value the same bodies of scholarship and work that might be essential for the demands of what's in front of you if you're working with Black students in Black communities and trying to honor the tradition that these students and that you come from if you're a Black teacher.
And with the art of Black teaching and talking about tradition, do we think that now in 2021 is the art of Black teaching lost? Do we feel like it's been whitewashed some? Because the way in which we're speaking about it, especially your story about Lift Every Voice and Sing and how they got translated and how they got passed. Right now, many of our Black teachers, and we know like the numbers have reduced drastically over the last century, but they're going through teacher ed prep programs that are predominantly white. So where are they actually going to get the knowledge or be taught what the art of Black teaching actually is? Or Jarvis, is that what we turn into the book for, Boo?
Somebody wrote this book. Part of this, but also this work that you're doing is like, this work that you're doing, the work that Ms. Guy is. Every time I'll talk to Ms. Guy will be flying all over the place to go find groups of Black teachers that she can be a part of and be in community with. And I think that, so I would never say that it's dead or completely whitewashed or like not around. I do think that those resources are still available for people to kind of pick up, reconfigure, and adapt to meet the demands of the moment that we're living in. But there are folks. I would say that it's absolutely alive in the work that folks like that you're doing, the work that folks like Sharif is doing, that I'm learning more and more about, and like really impressed with, and excited to think about how to bridge the connection between the stuff that's in the historical record with all the possibility and opportunities to kind of build on that for the current moment. But what I would say is that it's, even as I know that it does exist sometimes in individual teachers and in pockets of different places, it's nowhere near at the scale, unfortunately, at the scale that we see it at in the historical context when we think about these long-standing institutions that Black teachers created that became undermined in the 1960s, the kind of rolling out of desegregation that really integrated these institutions out of existence. And those were very important institutional hubs for doing this kind of creating opportunities for teachers to, Black teachers in particular, but all teachers, because Black teacher organizations never discriminated against white teachers, right? It was the white teacher organizations that had the kind of racially exclusive clauses in their institutions. It was the Black teacher orgs that ended up getting folded into the white teacher orgs and what came after. I would say that level of advocacy that we see in these organizations that were created over more than a century, it's unfortunately we don't see anything near that scale, but it doesn't mean that it's not, possible. Part of it has to do with the fact that so few teachers, like most teachers, know nothing about that history and that legacy and those traditions, because most teachers are going through teacher training programs, if they're going through any teacher training program at all, but that don't have any space made to think about the history of the teaching profession, let alone the history of Black teachers and all that they did, right? So
definitely. And Ms. Guy, would love to hear from you just through this art of Black teaching. How can we use some of these strategies to recruit and even sustain current Black teachers?
I want to shout out the Center for Black Educator Development, Citizen Ed, Black Educators Rock, the National Alliance of Black School Educators, the Black Teacher Project, the California Alliance of African American Superintendents Association, Black Education Twitter, as it were, the network of National Board Minoritized Educators, because these associations have sustained me as an educator, a Black educator in California, where African Americans are only 6 to 7% of the population. And they are carrying on the tradition that Jarvis speaks of in his book. And they are very accessible in the sense that, Black Educators Rock is on Facebook. So you can get help, assistance, guidance. You can go for information, accountability, commiseration with other Black educators. And I do agree with Jarvis, but I'm so happy, I'm so thankful and so blessed that there are educators, foundations, the fellowship. There are these places that Black educators can go to grow, to contribute, and to find camaraderie and community. So I do want to shout those out, because it can seem lonely depending on your state, depending on your city. But there are these organizations that are out there that are definitely doing the work. And I'm just, honored and proud to just shout those names out, to say that, because that has definitely sustained me in my teaching career.
And if I can, and I would want one of the things that I would say there is, I think that is, I absolutely think that's true, because Black teachers, such as all of us on this call, have consistently recognized that more needs to be done, and that so then we'll have these kind of organizations and affinity groups popping up in different places. But one of the things that I'm really, really excited about and hopeful about is that there will be a way that there can be some kind of building across these different kind of pockets of organizations and things that exist to function and operate in a much more intentional and kind of strategic way that we might learn from these kind of this networked world of Black educators that was very intentionally crafted with a very clear set of political intentions, even as there's, not to say that they're all of one mind, right? Black people are not ever all of one mind. There's always debate.
Yes.
Exactly. Range. And there has to be space for that. But there's a bottom line to the goals that many of these organizations have. And I think that we can learn a lot from the organizational strategies and how they use these organizations intentionally to support the work and to advocate for individual Black teachers that are trying to do things in isolation, but also for the broader field of Black education, keeping in mind students, communities and teachers, and what that means in the larger context of the national educational landscape, right? That's the only other thing that I would offer there.
Amazing. So I hate to shut down this conversation because we are coming up on time. I mean, there are so many things that came up today that we could do a whole other podcast series on, especially this notion about political clarity. Like that is like in my mind right now, like starting the basis of teaching just from political clarity. But what I love to do always is give each of my guests an opportunity to just have a final word or say a final word before we close out. Jarvis, I want to get a little embarrassment going though before we go. A little birdie told me that you can sing. So next time when you come up on this joint, you will be gracing us with your voice singing the national anthem, okay? The Black national anthem. But I want to give each of you an opportunity just to close out with some final words before I close the show. Ms. Guy, we can start with you and then followed by Jarvis, and then I'll close out.
Since there's such an interest in attracting and diversifying the teaching population, I would just like to close out by asking school districts, school administrators, to focus on the culture of the schools and why would a Black educator want to teach at a particular school? How can administrators, how can district leaders identify elements of their school culture that can be modified, that can be changed to make their school culture more amenable to recruiting and attracting and retaining African-American teaching talent?
Dope. Thanks, Ms. Guy. Jarvis.
Yeah, mine is simple. I would just say thank you. Thank you, especially to Ms. Guy, right? But also thank you to all of the Black teachers that I've had from preschool up and through college, right? I had every year of my life, I had a Black teacher that kind of poured into me and really gave me, shared with me the tradition that became really the shadow book to the book that I just wrote, which is a historical kind of, monograph. But so much of what I was able to write was because I had experiences and I had interpretive resources to kind of look at the historical record and to name things that so many people, unfortunately, have been looking past. And so I would say thank you to Ms. Guy and thank you to all the Black teachers doing the wonderful work that they're doing, but especially all the Black teachers that I had. And I always, love to share that fact that I had Black teachers and I recognize the power that Black teachers can have in the lives of Black students. And my first book is here because of the experiences that I have with Black teachers.
And what's the name of that book and where can people get it?
The book is called Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching. You can get it you can order it on Amazon, but it's currently out of stock because it's sold out online, but it will be back in stock in the next couple of days. But you can purchase it today from Harvard University Press. So if you go to the Harvard University Press website, you can purchase it from there. You can also purchase it from a number of independent Black booksellers, such as Frugal Books here in Roxbury, or Esselwan Books in Los Angeles.
Yes, y'all. Let's support this brother and his work. Let's support the art of Black teaching. So I would like to close out, and I just would like to thank Ms. Guy and Dr. Givens for joining us on today's show. This has been excellent and definitely been a Sankofa moment. And shout out to you guys for coming on. And as always, shout out to Citizens Ed and the Center for Black Educator Development for giving us this space to have these type of conversations. And shout out to everybody that is funding the work, supporting the work, and out there doing the work. I will see you guys back again next week at 12 for another live show. Thank you always for the support. See you guys next week.